There's a moment when a warm compress stops soothing your eyes and starts hurting them. Most people never notice the exact second it happens. One night, the warmth feels like relief, like something finally easing after a long day of screen time and dry, tired eyes. Then, seemingly out of nowhere, that same warmth starts to sting. Not comfortably warm anymore, burning, and most people just push through it, assuming that's simply what treatment feels like. But that shift from relief to burning is your body sending a warning most people ignore completely. Somewhere inside your eyelids right now, tiny glands are either helping you or working against you, depending on one single variable most people have never heard of. Temperature, not the temperature of the room, not the temperature outside, the temperature of the oil sitting inside your eyelids, in structures smaller than a grain of rice, doing a job most people don't even know exists. If you're watching this in your 50s, 60s, or 70s, this matters even more, because this exact pattern shows up most often in that age range, as these glands naturally slow down with time. Drop your age in the comments below. It helps show just how widespread this actually is. Most people believe heat is always the answer for irritated eyes. Warm it, soothe it, done. That's been the advice for decades, and for a lot of people, it's still correct. But there's a point where that same heat turns from medicine into a trigger. And almost nobody is ever told where that point is, or how to recognize it before the damage is already done. Here's the part that surprises most people the first time they hear it. Along the edge of your eyelid sit dozens of tiny oil-producing structures called meibomian glands. Their entire job is to release a thin, oily layer onto the surface of your eye every time you blink. That layer isn't decorative, it's functional. It sits on top of your tears and prevents them from evaporating too quickly, the same way a thin layer of oil on a puddle slows down evaporation on a hot day. Without it, your eyes dry out within minutes, no matter how much you blink or how many drops you use. And here's the part almost nobody realizes. That oil has a melting point. Just like butter left out on a kitchen counter needs a certain temperature before it turns from solid to liquid, in healthy eyes, researchers have found that this oil begins to soften and flow at around 32 degrees Celsius, just slightly below normal body temperature. That's why blinking alone is usually enough to keep it moving in healthy eyes. But in a condition called meibomian gland dysfunction, or MGD, something changes at the chemical level. The oil itself becomes thicker, more waxy, and its melting point rises. Some studies measuring this directly have found the melting point in affected glands can climb several degrees higher than in healthy eyes. And in more severely obstructed cases, it can rise high enough that even a properly heated compress struggles to fully liquefy it. So here's what that means in practice, and why the advice you've probably heard your whole life doesn't always hold up. You apply heat, expecting relief, the same relief you remember from years ago. But if your glands are already dysfunctional, that heat isn't gently melting fresh oil the way it used to. It's heating oil that's already been sitting stagnant inside a gland that hasn't drained properly in weeks, sometimes months. Oil that sits that long doesn't stay chemically neutral. It can oxidize, shifting toward a more acidic, more irritating composition, similar to the way cooking oil left too long on a stove starts to smell sharp and behave differently than fresh oil. Heat applied to that kind of oil doesn't calmly melt it out of the gland. It can intensify the irritation that was already quietly building underneath the surface, which is exactly why some people describe the sensation as burning rather than soothing. Now here's where a second factor comes into play, one that makes this even more complicated for a specific group of people. Your eyelid skin has its own protective barrier, a thin layer that keeps moisture in and outside irritants out. For most people, that barrier handles a warm compress just fine day after day with no issue at all. But for people with an underlying skin condition called ocular rosacea, that barrier works very differently. Rosacea is a chronic inflammatory skin condition, and research shows a striking number of people who have it. Some studies put the figure as high as 72%. Also experience related eye symptoms, even when those symptoms go unrecognized for years. In ocular rosacea, the small blood vessels near the surface of the eyelid are already more reactive, more prone to visible flushing, a pattern doctors call telangiectasia, which simply means small. Dilated blood vessels sitting close to the skin's surface add heat to skin that's already prone to that kind of vascular reactivity, and instead of calming it, you're doing the opposite. You're feeding a system that was already inflamed before you ever picked up the compress in the first place. This is the exact point where heat stops being treatment and starts being a trigger. And it explains something that confuses a lot of people who've dealt with this for years without ever getting a clear answer. Why a warm compress that used to feel wonderful suddenly starts producing redness that doesn't fade by the next morning. Once that cycle starts, more heat doesn't fix it, it reinforces it. The redness becomes chronic, not because the original problem got worse on its own, but because the treatment quietly became the aggravating factor, day after day, without anyone realizing the compress itself was the issue. So if heat isn't always the answer, how do you actually know when to stop reaching for the warm compress and start reaching for something cold instead? There's a simple pattern to watch for, and once you know it, you'll never have to guess again. Clinicians sometimes describe this as a shift from a congestive state to an inflammatory state, and your eyes usually tell you which one you're in if you know what signs to look for. Watch for these specific red flags: itching that appears suddenly, sharply, rather than a dull, heavy ache that builds slowly. Swelling that comes on fast within minutes rather than gradually over the course of a day. A sharp, stinging sensation, almost like a pinch rather than a thick, congestive feeling of pressure. Sensitivity to light that wasn't there an hour earlier. Redness that spreads quickly rather than sitting steadily in one small area. If what you're feeling is heaviness, thickness, a sense that something is blocked and needs to be loosened, that's usually the congestive pattern, and warmth may still genuinely help. But if what you're feeling is sharp, itchy, or rapidly swelling, that's an inflammatory pattern, and heat at that exact moment can make things measurably worse, sometimes within minutes. Here's a simple sensation test you can run anytime you're unsure which state you're in. Close your eyes for a moment. Notice the very first word that comes to mind without overthinking it. Heavy or sharp, blocked or itchy, dull or stinging. That single instinctive word is often enough to tell you which direction to go before you even reach for a compress. The reason this test works comes down to two opposite physiological responses happening inside your eyelid tissue. Heat causes vasodilation. It widens blood vessels, increases blood flow to the area, which helps loosen thickened oil and encourages it to drain. But it also increases swelling and redness if inflammation is already active in that tissue. Cold does the opposite. It causes vasoconstriction, narrowing those same blood vessels, reducing blood flow to the area, and calming the release of inflammatory signals your body produces during an active flare-up. Researchers studying ocular allergy put this to the test directly. In one controlled study, participants were exposed to grass pollen under controlled conditions specifically to trigger a real allergic eye reaction. They then tested cold compress therapy against other treatments, measuring redness, surface temperature, and symptom severity at regular intervals afterward. The group using cold compress therapy showed a measurable drop in surface redness and a noticeably faster symptom recovery within the first 20 minutes compared to relying on medication alone. That's not a small effect. That's your blood vessels responding directly and measurably to temperature in real time in a way you can actually feel within minutes of applying the compress. So the two treatments aren't competing with each other. They were never meant to replace one another. They're suited to two completely different underlying problems. Heat for blocked, congested glands that need loosening, cold for active, inflamed, itching tissue that needs calming. Using the wrong one at the wrong moment is why so many people feel like nothing works for them, when really they've just had the timing backwards the entire time. Now let's talk about how this is actually being managed today, because the tools available have changed significantly even in just the last year or two. Newer compressed technology now includes precision thermal sensors built directly into the device, designed specifically to prevent the compress from climbing past a safe temperature threshold and accidentally scalding. Delicate eyelid skin. This solves a problem that's existed for as long as people have been using warm compresses at home. A washcloth heated in a microwave has no reliable way of telling you it's gotten too hot until you're already feeling the burn. These newer sensor-equipped devices regulate themselves, holding a steady, effective temperature without the guesswork or the risk of overheating. On the cold side, there's been a similar shift, moving away from traditional ice packs and toward hydrogel-based cold masks designed specifically for the delicate skin around the eyes. The reason this matters more than it might sound is worth understanding. A hard ice pack pressed directly against the eye can drop the surface temperature too quickly and too unevenly, risking what's sometimes called an ice burn, a localized cold injury to the thin tissue near the cornea. Especially if it's left in place too long or pressed too firmly. Now, hydrogel masks are designed to distribute that cold more evenly and more gradually across the surface, giving you the vasoconstriction benefit without that same risk of localized tissue stress. If you're going to alternate between the two temperatures, and for a lot of people dealing with both congestive and inflammatory symptoms at different times, that's exactly the right approach. There's a safe way to do it. Start with a short warm period to loosen and liquefy any blocked oil sitting in the glands. Follow it with a short cooling period to calm the vessels and settle down any irritation that the warming step released. This alternating pattern is sometimes described as contrast therapy, and it allows you to get the drainage benefit of heat without leaving the tissue sitting in a prolonged inflamed state afterward. The key throughout all of this is duration and moderation. Short warm periods, short cool periods, never extreme temperatures held for extended stretches against skin, this delicate. So what does an actual nightly routine look like if you wanted to put all of this together correctly instead of just guessing night to night? Start with a gentle cleanse of the eyelid margin, removing debris and build up along the lash line before applying any temperature therapy at all. This step matters more than people realize because oil sitting underneath a layer of debris responds to heat far less effectively than a clean lid margin would. Then apply your compress based on what the sensation test told you earlier that day. Warm if the day's dominant feeling was heaviness and blockage. Cold if it was itching, sharp stinging, or fast developing swelling. Immediately afterward, and this next step gets skipped constantly, do a short series of deliberate blink exercises. Full, complete blinks, gently squeezing the eyelids together, holding for a second, then fully releasing. Repeat this in a slow, deliberate rhythm, not a quick, casual blink. This step matters because a compress alone doesn't move anything on its own. It softens the oil, but it's the mechanical action of blinking or gentle lid massage that actually helps express that softened oil out of the gland and onto the eye's surface, where it can do its job. Skipping this step is one of the most common reasons people say a compress isn't working, when really half of the actual process was left out entirely. If you follow this pattern consistently, alternating temperatures appropriately and following through with the blink or massage step, and the burning continues or keeps returning night after night despite switching correctly, that's the signal to stop self-managing and see an eye care specialist. A specialist can evaluate the glands directly using imaging techniques that show gland structure in detail, something no amount of home treatment can assess on its own. In more advanced or stubborn cases, in-office thermal pulsation treatments exist that apply carefully controlled, sustained heat directly to the inner eyelid alongside gentle pulsing pressure, achieving a level of gland clearing that a compress at home typically can't match on its own. Persistent burning despite correctly alternating temperatures can indicate the gland dysfunction has progressed further than compressed therapy alone can resolve. That's not a failure on your part. It simply means the next step needs a professional evaluation, and there's no reason to wait once you notice the pattern isn't improving. The reassuring part in all of this is that once you understand the difference between these two temperatures and what each one is actually doing at a biological level inside your eyelids, this stops being confusing. You're not guessing anymore, reaching for whatever's familiar and hoping it helps. You have a simple sensation test, a temperature choice grounded in real physiology, and a full nightly routine that respects what your eyes are actually telling you in the moment. Most people go years, sometimes their entire lives, reaching for whatever's in the freezer or whatever feels familiar from childhood without ever knowing there was a right answer waiting underneath all that confusion. Now you know it. If this helped make sense of something that's been bothering you for a while, subscribe for more breakdowns like this one, explained clearly without the guesswork. Let me know in the comments which one you've been using, heat or cold, and whether this changes what you'll reach for tonight.